Cool. Well, welcome. This is our first fall seminar STAR workshop of the year. So thank you guys for coming and we appreciate you being here. Today, we're going to talk about psychology research sort of generally and how to take it from the lab to real life. And we'll do introductions in a second, but what we're going to go through today are basically what is the STAR Scholars Program, just a little overview. What is research in general, how to create knowledge through research, and how psychology research plays into that. What research involvement can look like for undergrad, so how to get involved in research, what you might be doing in a research lab, and then how to actually take the skills that you've learned in a research lab outside of the lab. So what is after maybe an undergrad or grad school research experience? What can you do with what you've learned? So that's sort of what we're going to be going through today. But first, a couple introductions. So my name is Maddie. I'm a fifth-year graduate student and a STAR Scholars mentor. Broadly, I study the cognitive mechanisms of attention and distraction in ADHD. I am working on my dissertation right now, so that's really fun. But yeah, that's about me.
Hi, everybody. I haven't said anything yet, but my name is Brittany Parham. I'm also a STAR mentor. I am a sixth year graduate student. I'm in the joint social work and developmental psychology areas. So I have a master's in social work that I got from the University of Michigan throughout my process here. I'm also in the process of writing my dissertation. So trying to wrap it up in this last year, but I'm hoping that today I have like a wealth of knowledge to share with you guys.
Hi, and I am Dr. Lustig. I have the privilege of being a faculty member who gets to work with STAR. And I also work with the senior and honors thesis program here at Michigan. So if you are a Michigan student, I would love to see you on that end sometime too.
And I forgot to say, I'm in the cognition and cognitive neuroscience area of the psych department. So we'll kind of go through how psychology breaks down into all these sort of like smaller domains in a little bit, but just to put that out there. Okay, so basically, what is the STAR Scholars Program? We have a couple goals, and basically it's to prepare students to be researchers. We're providing one-on-one mentoring in a structured format, and our goal is to increase the number of students conducting advanced research and academically support an inclusive community of students. And so we do try to target traditionally underrepresented student groups and provide opportunities for them to get into undergraduate research opportunities and sort of learn the beginning stages of research. So who is involved in STARS? Our STAR mentors are going to be PhD students at Michigan in the psychology department. We have a good range of students also from across the various areas of psychology. And then our faculty leader, director is of course, Dr. Lustig right here. And then Julie is one of our admin staff members who may pop in here and there. You'll get emails from her for sure. And then, of course, you guys, the undergraduates that become part of our program, become our mentees. And the fall program that we do here is a more free-for-all sort of whoever can come and attend these Zoom sessions, open to everybody, not just Michigan students. And then the winter mentoring program is our more sort of official program where it's an application process and the deadline here is November 3rd. And I can put the link in the chat as well for the application. But that's an application process. So we will review and admit students to the program. You'll be matched with a specific mentor with a couple other students. And then basically you'll meet throughout the semester and do either individual workshops with your mentor or larger group workshops that are kind of like this, just in person. So that's sort of the difference between fall and winter. Fall sort of getting your feet wet, figuring out if this is something that you think you would benefit from. And then the winter workshops are much more interactive, much more in depth, and focus on training and sort of tangible skills. Okay, so that's just sort of the general STAR Scholar program. And then Brittany will talk about how to generate new knowledge.
Yes. Okay, because you're gonna have to go to the next. Okay, so in general, the process of creating new knowledge, this is actually the hardest part when you're trying to come up with your idea, trying to figure out what it is that you love about psychology or what it is that you want to study long term. So choosing your topic, picking your area of interest. Most people, if you're here, you pick psychology, but there are smaller areas of interest that you can also pick: developmental, cognitive, personality, and social context. I'm giving our own smaller ones. There are tons of other ones. And then you do your background information. So figuring out what we already know about the topic. So I study siblings and their involvement with their counterparts or their other siblings that may be involved in juvenile justice or some type of criminal justice activity. And so I've realized that I was really interested in my own siblings' journeys and how we turned out so different. So figuring out what we already know. So are there people that already study what I want to study? Are there people that already do what I want to do? And what do we already know about that? Then we kind of refine our topic. You generate a question that hasn't already been answered. So we've already figured out that siblings are the longest relationship in your lifetime. We've already figured out that they have significant similarities, but also significant differences. And so I decided to come up with my own questions about how they impact whether or not you decide to get involved in any type of delinquent behavior. Are you just like your sibling? Are you guys different? I'm using myself as an example because I know the most about my own topic. After that, you design a study. So this is where you figure out what methods you'll use to answer your questions. So there's lots of different methods. The main two that we talk about are quantitative and qualitative methods. Quantitative is exactly as it sounds. It deals with more of the numbers, the statistics. It's that A plus B equals C. And then we have our qualitative work where it's more about the story. It's more about finding out the individualized observations you see from people. And it's not just that, it's tons of different ways to do qualitative research. Again, only giving my own examples. I am a mixed methods researcher. So I do both quantitative and qualitative work. The quant work does the stats, and then my qual work, I use field studies. And then we gather our results. We conduct the study and gather data. I'm currently collecting data with folks that have had criminal justice past and currently incarcerated folks. After we do that, we share our findings, and this is where we often do this through writing and publishing research papers. We also go to lots of conferences, and we also try to give back to the communities in which we collected data from. The overall knowledge continuum. So how do we know about the subject already? So we have to continue to explore and explain. I know this feels like a never-ending cycle because it is. Every time we find one answer, there's always something else that we question about even the answer that we just gave. How do we even get here? So we explore understanding a phenomenon in that relationship. And that's only a little bit, but then that explaining, trying to explain how something works takes a lot. You have to determine the causes of the problem, what's the phenomenon, and the relationships. And then overall, the types of research questions. So you have your basic research, your translational research, and then your clinical research. So for your basic research, this is how does it work? What is going on naturally? This is a lot of observational studies, a lot of like I just want to know what this population is doing. That translational research is what do we need to do? What do we need to know to apply these findings to people? So this is a lot of folks in psychology don't necessarily do a lot of intervention work, but we in turn do a lot of studies and experiments and trying to figure out what exactly is going on in the human brain and the human body. And then how can we generalize that to other people? How do we translate that to the real world? How can other folks that aren't researchers use this research? And then overall, then we have our clinical research, which is how can we treat people with these findings and what are the effects of this? So that translational research, we realized that I'm going to use my study as an example again. That basic research, we realized that siblings had an impact over your life long term. Translational research, we realized, well, maybe we could use siblings in order to help get the other folks out of delinquent situations. Maybe we need to include them in that work. So we realized that maybe the family unit is the clear difference here. And then the clinical research, they would actually test that. We would go in and see whether or not actually involving siblings in that therapy or in that one-on-one reentry programming if that actually made a difference and whether or not it had any real effects on their long-term outcomes. And then lastly, we have all of our types of research methods. I've actually said a couple of these, but experiments, the method to determine cause and effect. We have our cross-sectional research, which is observing people at one point in time. That's where we do maybe a survey right now to see exactly how you feel.
Make a table.
And then longitudinal is we're following people over a long period of time. That's a lot of developmental work. We want to be able to say that this isn't a one-time thing, that we can follow this population and it happens over a long period of time. Those longitudinal studies are the ones where we can grasp the most causal relationship, where we can say like this happened because of this. Case studies, which is observing a particular person or phenomenon in detail. And then our behavioral studies are observing people's behavior or physiology. And then our self-report is asking people to report on their own experience. That's a direct survey. I'm sure you guys have done that 1,000 times since before you even got here. Okay, and then lastly, I did give a brief overview of that quant and qual data. Like I said, that quant data is how things are quantified, how can they be measured. The goal is to acquire breadth. We want to be able to say like, this percentage of people have this, and this percentage of people, maybe the probability that if this happens to you, most likely this will happen to you. We want to be able to say those with our quantitative numbers, and then answers explanatory questions. The qualitative work is data that cannot be quantified. You can't really put a number to your story, but this is to acquire depth. We're trying to really dig deep into those questions and figure out exactly what it is that's motivating these changes. And these are exploratory questions. So right now I'm doing exploratory work on if your family really is supportive, does that help you? Does that guide you? Does that motivate you to stay out of trouble? That's the qualitative piece to work, and that you really can't answer in a survey. Okay, overall, to summarize, the type of knowledge that we already have, do we know a lot or a little bit about this topic? Determines the type of questions that we ask. Are we exploring something versus are we explaining something? The basics versus translational versus clinical research. In psychology, you can be in any discipline, developmental, cognitive, and do basic research, translational research, and even clinical research. Then it determines methods we use to answer those questions. Experiments, case studies, longitudinal studies, whichever best fits your project. And then lastly, the effects that the type of data we collect. So the qualitative versus the quantitative. What type of data are we collecting based on the type of research that we're going to be doing?
Awesome. So we've mentioned already all the different sort of domains of psychology that we could fall under. Brittany and I, of course, being in two separate areas of the psychology department. But this is an overview then of sort of the rest of our areas under just Michigan's psychology umbrella. So we've got social work and psychology, biopsychology, social psych, clinical psych, developmental psych, personality and social context, educational psychology, psychology and women's and gender studies, and cognition and cognitive neuroscience. So just these 9 alone represent a huge range of research questions that could be addressed using all of those different types of methods, starting often with that exploratory research and then leading more towards more explanatory methods. So a huge range of interests that you yourself could try to figure out what maybe like piques your interest the most, and then try to seek out research labs that study those things, or at least get close to studying those things. Because again, the range is definitely here at Michigan. So you just have to sort of figure out what speaks to you. And so we'll talk a little bit about what working in a research lab might look like, and what the structure of a research lab, even like, what does it mean to be in a research lab? So the sort of initial hierarchy of a research lab tends to have your principal investigator up top, your PI. And so that's going to be, for the most part, a faculty advisor. So it'll be some professor who has a research lab that is studying some relatively specific topic. So my lab studies cognitive control and attention. And under that can go into a couple different tasks and studies looking at ADHD, looking at distraction, looking at specific tasks, and using different methods. So it usually has one sort of topic domain of the lab. Under the PI then, you have your graduate students, your PhD students, and then often there'll be some postdoctoral students. And so those are going to be folks that have already gotten their PhD, so they've done their 5 years of grad school-ish, and they are then joining another lab or being funded by their same advisor to either continue building a specific set of research skills that they don't feel like they honed as strongly in grad school, or maybe to transition fields. So if your grad school expertise was in one topic and you really are interested in this other topic, though, a postdoc is a really good way to sort of get that expertise sort of building. And they're usually sort of in the 1 to 3 year range. Some people become sort of indefinite postdocs and just sort of ride that out for a little while. But they are people that have already gotten their PhD and are just continuing to do research. Then you'd have a lab manager, for the most part, underneath the grad students and the postdocs. They're going to do and help with a lot of the administration that's required in research, which is a ton. So there's the science of research, and then there's sort of the administration and background work of research. Having a lab manager is nice because they will take care of a lot of that stuff, but it's also really good to know and learn how to do the administration yourself, because not everyone will have a lab manager. And it's nice to know that you know how to do what you need to do without necessarily asking or relying on others. And then underneath the lab manager would be the undergraduate research assistants. And so that would be you all if you were to join a lab. So we'll talk a little bit about what your RA tasks might look like in a lab. So doing human research, it might look like setting up a lab, working with different populations, whatever your lab, the type of people that your lab is interested in studying. You would likely be doing some sort of data entry. You could be analyzing videos. You could be doing literature reviews, which is just combing the literature for already existing research. So again, building that sort of what do we already know bucket of research is often something that we recruit RAs to do and help out with. And it's a really, really good skill for, especially for your research papers that you will have to do in classes anyway. But so that's just human research. Even in psychology, there's all sorts of animal research as well. And so if that's your jam, you could totally be in an animal lab working with handling the animals, doing managing surgeries or post-operative care, behavioral tests with animals, tissue collection, analyzing videos, molecular analysis techniques, and a whole bunch of things in the animal labs that is really cool. And then there's the other option sort of acquiring existing data. So a lot of times our labs will have studies that have collected data and either a grad student graduated or just it doesn't get analyzed. And so there's just repertoires of data sometimes sitting around. So you could easily be, if you've gotten to sort of the independent research part of being in a research lab, which might look like doing like a senior or honors thesis project, you might be able to acquire already existing data and analyze it, or maybe synthesize it in a different way, or something of that sort, and take that data and create your own project from it. That does tend to sort of be more of the advanced students, so that have been doing some undergraduate research for a good portion of time. So things to keep in mind, though, about joining a lab. Details vary lab by lab, not just across like human research and animal research either. All of our labs in CCN doing human research vary deeply across labs on our methods that we use and the work that the RAs would be doing. And then responsibilities will also vary with experience. Again, if you've been in the lab for a long time, or you have maybe stronger coding knowledge than others, and you might be asked to code programs or program experiments or analyze data using R. And so responsibilities could vary based on your experience in research and your just sort of general experimental skills. Lab meeting attendance might be required, so definitely confirm that with your PI or grad student. And experience could then result in an honors or senior thesis, like I had mentioned, and the thesis could very well be published. If it's a good body of work and you work well to sort of write it up into a nice paper, that's definitely publishable. And so it could be very nice to leave undergraduate with a couple publication or two. And a lot of that can come from existing data in the lab also. And then depending on the PI or the lab, there might be additional skill building workshops. Maybe they'll have graduate students lead stuff or walk you through things, or there'll be other workshops that pop up that you would get sort of suggested to attend by your PI. So you would just want to vary and check out with or confirm with your PI, or again, grad student, lab manager, whoever you're sort of working the closest with, on what would be expected of you in a lab. So for my lab, this is the cognitive neuroimaging lab. It's somewhat of an old picture, but even just looking at the picture though, of these however many people, John down at the bottom here is my PI, and the rest of us, there's only 3 grad students in the picture. So the rest are all undergraduate RAs and 1 postdoc. But so there can be a lot of RAs in a lab. And generally in my lab, our RA responsibilities include attending our weekly lab meetings. It can depend on your schedules, of course, because finding a single hour that overlaps with 20 people is not an easy feat. So again, that would be something you would just work out with your lab manager or PI and make sure you're like reading agendas and minutes and stuff. It might look like presenting papers at lab meetings. Often we have RAs running our participant in-person sessions. Those sessions include different methodologies that could span from just administering like computer tasks, or we use eye tracking a lot. So our RAs learn how to conduct eye tracking studies, which requires just setting up some camera software and doing cognitive tasks, and it tracks where your eyes go. So some of these are really cool skills to come out of undergrad with, especially if you're really looking into grad school. Literature reviews, like I mentioned, is a really big skill and something RAs are often tasked with. We do have a lot of our RAs programming our cognitive tasks, and that's a really good way to get involved with designing cognitive experiments and cognitive tasks, and being involved in the conversation with your grad students, postdocs, and PI about like what details of a task make sense and why. And so learning that through the programming of the task is something a lot of our undergrads do. And it gets a little coding experience as well. You're sort of working with these softwares that are pretty requisite in grad school. And so it's nice to sort of get some of those at least familiar earlier. And then learning to analyze data using R, which is also its own programming language. So learning some programming along the way and some coding is something our RAs work with our grad students and postdocs on a lot. So this is sort of a broad overview of what like being an RA in Dr. Jonidis's lab would look like.
This is my lab. Well, being a joint student, I'm actually in 3 different labs. This is my psych lab. In the middle, we have Dr. Vonnie McLeod, who is the faculty member in charge of that lab. She studies poverty and child development. So our lab in general, we have projects that stem on racial socialization, discrimination, poverty, child development, overall well-being, family-based surveys and interventions. So most of our projects include a mother or guardian and youth pair. And if not, we do a lot of longitudinal research where we follow families for long periods of time, trying to figure out what happens through different developmental stages. So the grad students are everyone else in that picture except for the one where we have an arrow pointing to our head, because this was our previous RA who just graduated in May. So we are looking for a new RA in our lab. So that just a heads up. But we have our grad students design a lot of research studies. We collect our own data a lot of times. We use a lot of the data that our lab has collected in the past to create new questions and new analyses. And then we also go to a lot of conferences and do a lot of publications together. We do a lot of group writing where 1 or 2 people in the lab might be working on a project and then 3 other people are working on something different, but using maybe the same data set. Our past RAs and what we're currently looking for are folks that are interested in learning how to do literature reviews. Maddie mentioned that a minute ago. And then coding, we have some coding of our qualitative data, which means that we went and got some stories from folks about our research question. And now we need to go through and find themes and relative things that are relative across the whole population, things that pop out for certain folks. And so we need some people to kind of do some transcriptions and some codings and kind of go through these stories and read the stories and see what they find. We have some data collection and management going on. We have a lot of outstanding projects that are like wrapping up, and then our RA left us, and so we're so sad. And then last, I said and more, because it's always, you never know what project might pop up. For example, our current RA, her name was Daisy. I had another project in the School of Social Work where I was building a database using the prosecutor's files from Washtenaw County. And so she got to have like a paid extra thing on the side where we had some extra funding to hire an undergraduate student to do some of that coding and that one-on-one data collection and analysis. So she got a lot of experience there. And now she has an amazing recommendation letter for whichever grad school she ever wants to attend. Because she did such an amazing job. But our RAs are essential to like running our lab. So anybody that is interested, please look up the McLeod lab, see what's going on and see what projects we have. And feel free to reach out to myself, or her name is Diawe Benson, who has another. I'll put our emails in the chat if anybody's interested. But this is something that's going on this semester. It's not a paid internship, but I do believe that our past RA Daisy might have done it for a class credit, which we'll talk about later.
Cool. So traditionally, or in the past, we've taken a 5-minute break here, but I kind of think we're probably fine to keep going unless anyone feels strongly about the break. Okay. So now we're going to talk about taking all of this, so from the lab to real life. So what does it look like once you're out of a research lab in an academic research setting as well? So there's actually a ton of career options, which I'll admit I also didn't even really realize coming into grad school. It's not one of the most advertised things traditionally in undergrad. Maybe it's becoming better, but when I was an undergrad in experimental psychology, I was not really told what was available to me, or it really seemed like grad school might have been the only option, and it isn't necessarily. So there's a huge amount of career options that our graduates from psychology end up at. And so user experience research at some sort of industry organization is sort of the phrasing of how we differentiate between academic institutions and like sort of the corporate world industry. And so user experience is an option of actually conducting research on how people, consumers interact with either web interfaces or company products. And so basically it is doing a lot of cognitive research in this industry setting of like, okay, how are people interacting with this product that I've put out? And how would that interaction affect how I design the product then? So that's a really cool option that I think sounds pretty fun. But then there's other like academic options of psychology professor at an institution, MSU in this instance, maybe a postdoctoral researcher at the Michigan Institute of Social Research, which would also have options for like staff researchers. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a postdoc, you have to go to a faculty position as well. You can do staff research at a lot of these institutions as well. And then of course there's the faculty option of here in this instance, University of San Francisco. And so these are a couple examples of, I think, some recent graduates of the program or alumni of some psych labs that have gone on to these very specific positions, but just goes to show a little bit of the range of options that you can do with a psychology research degree. And so why get involved in research then? What do you really get out of it as a whole? And so beyond just research skills, there's a lot of other advantages of learning interpersonal skills and analytical skills as well. And I think the PhD specifically actually offers a really broad range of skill learning that, again, is not something I really realized coming in. And it's a lot broader than just learning, oh, I know how to conduct a research project. And so of those, though, the research skills, you do learn how to frame a research question, develop a theory or ideas around that research question based on, again, past literature, gathering that information of past and current literature, research, whatever you're trying to explore, observing some results, and then being able to summarize and communicate your results. And so that's a big one that ties into interpersonal skills then. Mm-hmm. And so being able to communicate across, oftentimes you'll be doing, there'll be multiple teams involved in a single research project. So being able to communicate across internal members to your lab and then external members to whatever other teams you're working with is a really, really big skill and a really necessary skill. Also communicating your research results to the world. So putting together papers, presenting posters at conferences, that kind of thing. Collaboration, active listening, again, a lot of that like cross-team interaction. Patience. Patience is a big one because research is not a fast-moving process. There's not a lot of like instant gratification in the research process. And so having that patience, trusting that the project will pan out. And even if it doesn't, that's also not the end of the world, but patience. Taking responsibility for the tasks that you're required to do, and responsibility for good science practices as well, I'd say. And then customer service, really. So I've had research assistants come into RA positions that don't have prior research experience and think that they have nothing to contribute then, but they've done customer service. Running in-person participants is almost 100% customer service. It is interacting with a naive person to your sort of goals and making sure they're comfortable, walking them through your protocol with patience and sort of compassion, and just that kind of sort of customer service relationship is certainly present. And then, of course, analytical skills, which tie into research skills a lot, but sort of a little broader. So defining problem areas, organizing and analyzing data, developing solutions, and evaluating evidence and ideas, all really crucial to the research process and also still really relevant to real life. A lot of that is just critical thinking, and really honing in that ability to problem solve throughout the research process. And so these are also good things to sort of just have in mind as concepts that you know that you can describe your skills as well. So if you end up applying to grad school or applying to research positions, even highlighting things of this slide that you think you're already good at is a good way to like sort of track what skills you do have and be able to present them to people. But all in all, the possibilities of a research degree and sort of just research experience are pretty endless. Facebook, or Meta, is actually the largest employer of Psych grads, maybe in general, but I know psych. And so there's been a ton of us that have graduated and end up at Meta Reality Labs, and then a bunch of whole other different domains just within Meta itself. But all of these, I'm sure we've had Michigan psych grads at, and the range, the opportunities really are endless. So research is not sort of one size fits all, but it can really generalize to a lot of different domains of working world, I guess. Okay. Anyway.
That's okay. Okay. So just to piggyback off that really quickly, I am not interested in going into academia. I'm not going to say I'll never go into academia because you never know where you might end up. But I plan on going into government work when I leave out of here to study juvenile justice policy and to help create interventions and programmings for folks currently in juvenile justice situations that will help them stay out of those situations. I have just really briefly 2 or 3 folks that have graduated in the last 3 years that currently work for Google. And they one of them has a joint appointment between Google and Berkeley. She gets to do the teaching stuff, but also gets to do the industry stuff. That's just a couple of different examples of what you can possibly do. And then but there's also different ways that research has changed the world. And so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Mamie Phillips Clark, but she and her husband, Kenneth Clark, studied racial preferences and identity in Black children in integrated schools compared to segregated schools. And in the family's doll studies, children were presented with 4 dolls, 2 Black and 2 white. They were asked which doll they liked best. More than 65% of those kids chose the white doll, and these findings were used in the Brown versus Board of Education case that dismantled school segregation. And so, as you can see, psychology had a serious impact on policy change. That's the kind of psychologist I would like to be. We have Rico True, who was born, Reiko True, who was born in Japan. She studied university in Tokyo, one of only 3 women in the class of 1980. She remains passionate about equal access to mental health care and lobbied to create the first mental health center in California to serve Asian Americans. She then led the center, ensuring staff were trained in Asian languages and culture. That is actually a big portion of our psychology research right now, is how to integrate different cultures into the current psychological practices that we have. So the stuff that Dr. True did then is still being done now. It's a never-ending cycle of research. George Sanchez got his start in low-income public schools in rural Arizona. He invited director of Venezuela, the Ministry of Education, and he campaigned against unfair treatment of minority children in New Mexico's education system, and one of the first psychologists to challenge the IQ test and biased research on intelligence. And we are still doing that research today. So we have one of the first psychologists that did that work, but we are currently still doing that work, including for our grad students. So right now, a lot of schools, especially since after the pandemic, are not looking for GRE scores as heavily as they used to be. So a lot of that has changed, and a lot of that came from psychology research and how we even look at intelligence altogether. Got a couple more. So Jennifer Eberhart. Her research shows how subliminal images activate racial stereotypes, changing what and how people see. So she investigates the largely unconscious yet deeply ingrained ways that individuals racially code and categorize people, with a particular focus on the association between race and crime. So she uses these findings to raise awareness about stereotypes in the criminal justice system and in education. And in 2014, she received a MacArthur Foundation Award for her groundbreaking work. And so this is, as we can see, play out every single day in the news and in other places, of how racial profiling has impacted not only the current justice system, but the justice system in the past. And a lot of this work continues to change as we see lots of trainings being implemented for folks based off this work. How do we train people to not act upon their biases when they are in that field? And then lastly, this is our alum, the assistant professor at Cornell, writes for 538, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and others, part of a special committee of advising presidential COVID-19 team, the Department of Health and Human Services, on barriers to vaccinate uptake and include health equity. We actually have a couple of folks that have been alum, as well as faculty that currently have done some sort of government committee. I don't know what they're called, but if you're being asked to be a part of some type of special committee from the presidential election, we have my advisor that was asked to be on the presidential committee to decrease childhood poverty in 10 years. So not only were there psychologists, but there were economists and there were anthropologists. There were tons of people in the field gathered together to solve one problem. And understanding the psychological nature of not only poverty, but in this case, health and the impact of COVID-19, a lot of that research came from psychologists. Like, how are we interacting with the propaganda that's been out about vaccinations? How are some people choosing to be vaccinated and others are not? What is going into that decision? And that came from psychology.
Okay, so just to sort of wrap it up, there's a couple different ways to start getting involved in research. This program, STARS, and other programs like us, is sort of an exposure program, helps you prepare to be involved in research eventually, going through trainings and sort of the ground basis of what might be required of a research program. There's actual research programs like UROP and SROP. UROP is undergrad summer or undergrad research opportunity program, and then SROP is summer research opportunity program, both at the University of Michigan. So that's going to be an actual research program where you would sign up or apply for the program, I believe, and then you would be directly sort of taken on by a grad student or a postdoc and conduct your own independent research. You can find open listings at this Michigan research portal, which I actually just learned about. So that's really, this is a really good resource to look at open listings of current research opportunities within labs. And then one of the best ways to get involved in a research lab is to get to know your GSIs and your professors. I've had so many of my RAs, and my best RAs also come from students that I taught in my discussion section of Psych 240, which is the Intro to Cognitive Psych here. And so making that a personal connection between mostly your GSIs really are going to be one of those really good ways to get involved in a research lab. And then you're also not just a face or like a name on an application. So you can actually talk with them about the opportunity. They know you to an extent of what you would be able to contribute to the lab. So I highly recommend that as the main gateway towards research. There's a couple ways to get credit for research as well. So there's 2 different courses that Michigan offers for undergrads. Psych 326 is a independent study lab or class that you would do 1 to 4 credits with at least 3 working hours per credit, sort of depending on your ability to commit. So you would work that out with your grad student or advisor. You must submit a paper or complete a presentation or some sort of final report at the end of the semester, determined by the lab or the PI. And it can count as the second experiential lab for BCN or psych majors. And so there is some lab requirement that this would satisfy. And then Psych 331 is also another option. And so this would be a 4-credit course, and it does require an application. And so you'll be required to write a literature review, develop and present a poster. So it's a more sort of comprehensive beginning to end research opportunity. It can count as a methods lab or as a second methods lab, if you already have credit for a methods lab, or an upper level writing requirement. So these are both some tangible course options to register. And oftentimes if you talk to somebody, a grad student PI, about joining a lab, they would want you to sign up for at least or enroll in at least 326. And it builds a little bit of that accountability. You can volunteer for labs, but it's nice for us on sort of the higher end of having undergrad RAs to ensure there's some like accountability to maintain commitment to the lab. So likely you would be working for some course credit. And that is sort of it. So that's the general overview of taking psychology research, being in a psychology lab, and what that applies to out in the real world, what kind of skills you might gain from a research lab, how you might get involved in research. And so it does form a bit of a broad overview of the entire STAR Scholars Program. And so we'll sort of dig deeper into a lot of these different facets throughout the fall semester, and then even deeper into our winter program, where you do get a little bit more of that one-on-one attention and more in-depth workshops on a lot of these topics. Feel free to shoot us an email if you have any questions about Star Scholars, and more information can be found on the Star Scholar Program webpage through LSNA. But we also have, this is our flyer for the semester of our next upcoming workshops. So definitely be sure to attend the ones that you can if you're interested in pursuing research. And if you're interested in the winter program, it is nice to attend some of the fall programs to sort of show commitment to the program, since it does end up being a commitment. We are meeting weekly and expecting you guys to participate and interact with us in the research training process. So definitely come to the rest of the programs and apply for our winter mentoring program. Do you guys have any questions? If you have any questions, feel free to unmute or raise your hand or put them in the chat. And I just sent a link in the chat that also has all of the sessions signups for the fall sessions through Michigan, and they'll all be virtual as well. So if you're not a Michigan student, you can still attend, just like today.
Well, thank you so much to Brittany and Maddie for a great presentation on all of this. And Brittany, I didn't know that about Vonnie and being on that committee, so we're gonna have to update those slides.
Yeah, no, it's one of my favorite things. I was like, what? She doesn't talk about any of that stuff.
Yeah, we're gonna have to get her. Yeah, we're gonna have to get her in for a speaker for the winter. I think we'll see if you can get her to twist her arm into that. I do also want to point out that both Brittany and Maddie are also doing work that makes an impact. So, you know, Brittany talked about some of the stuff at the prosecutor's office. Maddie's doing on stuff that could potentially lead to better treatments for ADHD. So you definitely do not have to wait until you become a faculty member to do that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So join Brittany's lab and learn all about how you can get involved.
Oh, please. I have so much work. Please. I have so much stuff. I forgot that part. Let me put that in the chat.
Yeah, that would be terrific.
Any questions? You can also feel free to type them in the chat. Any questions about the program, about psych research?
If anything comes up later, you're also able to email us, so that's always an option. But we appreciate you guys at least being here for the first one of the semester.